The first surviving county report from the outskirts of St. Francisville describes a scene so disordered that investigators struggled to determine where the violence began. According to a clerk's handwritten account, dated the 2nd of August, 1858, the head of Bennett Caldwell was found at the foot of the veranda steps shortly after sunrise, resting in dew-wet grass, as though placed there deliberately. The body itself lay several yards higher on the porch, positioned against a toppled dining chair. Witnesses disagreed on when the killing occurred, yet most agreed the fatal blow came during the previous evening's anniversary gathering, an event the Caldwell family hosted each year to display prosperity. That display had ended with 8 white attendees dead before dawn, though the order of those deaths remained so tangled that the parish doctor refused to certify a timeline. Further into the same document, compiled from testimonies of surviving guests, one finds contradictory descriptions of the dining hall just moments before calamity. Some recalled raised glasses and polite conversation. Others insisted tension already hung in the room, as though something unseen moved between the tables. What is certain is that several guests began to collapse within minutes of each other, each afflicted by sudden sickness that no physician present understood. The house servants, who later spoke to an itinerant Methodist historian decades afterward, said the first shouts echoed down the corridor, only moments after Caldwell stepped away from his place at the head of the table. Those private accounts, though disputed by plantation families, indicate that not all the sickness could be explained as mere coincidence. Parish records written in longhand suggest that once the initial panic began, order disintegrated with startling speed. The Caldwell residence, a sprawling structure built with levee timber and raised brickwork, became a maze of overturned chairs, abandoned plates, and splintered doors as guests attempted to flee in different directions. Some rushed toward the courtyard, while others attempted to reach the secondary staircase that led to the library wing. These frantic movements, recorded in later depositions, help explain why bodies were discovered in so many separate locations: 2 near the grand dining table, 2 along the main hall, 1 collapsed by the rear exit, and 3 more scattered across the grounds. The confusion of movement in those final minutes would make later reconstruction nearly impossible for local authorities. As deputies stepped through the property that morning, they documented not just the dead, but the peculiar uniformity of their wounds. Several victims appeared to have suffered from catastrophic internal failure, while others bore unmistakably violent injuries inflicted by farm tools repurposed for lethal use. The parish sheriff, writing in a letter to the district judge dated the 4th of August, described the scene as an orchestration of destruction executed with a precision unbecoming of chance. His remarks, though couched in cautious language, reveal that investigators believed multiple methods of killing unfolded almost simultaneously. This complexity led to competing narratives. Some framed the event as an attempted uprising, others as an act of private vengeance timed to coincide with a crowded celebration. What transformed the incident from a local tragedy into a regional alarm was the discovery of Bennett Caldwell's son lying lifeless inside the stable that same morning. The stable, located behind the orchard windbreak, was typically locked during festivities, yet the latch had been forced. Deputies found the younger Caldwell bound upright to a support beam, his posture indicating he had been alive when secured there. Parish archivists who later reviewed the coroner's notes emphasized the mixture of blunt force trauma and carefully placed puncture wounds. Unlike the chaotic injuries found within the main house, these marks suggested deliberation rather than opportunity. The stable scene convinced the authorities that the violence was not merely reactive panic, but part of a coordinated intent to eliminate the Caldwell lineage entirely. The morning survey reached another turning point when searchers located the body of the overseer, Harlan, sprawled beside an upturned serving cart near the central hallway. His throat wound, described in the coroner's ledger as opened by a broad-edged implement, pointed unmistakably to direct interpersonal confrontation. Several enslaved workers later said, in interviews conducted many decades afterward, that Harlan had been drinking heavily throughout the evening. That detail, though peripheral, helps explain why he may have confronted the assailant alone, rather than coordinating with other armed staff. With Caldwell dead, his son murdered, and his overseer felled in the hallway, the plantation's entire command structure had collapsed within what researchers today estimate as a span of less than 15 minutes. By mid-morning, word had already traveled from the outskirts of St. Francisville to neighboring parishes, carried by riders who described the scene in phrases that grew more sensational with each retelling. Some early telegram drafts, preserved in private collections, claimed the estate had been seized by insurgents. Others insisted poison alone explained the devastation. Still others reported that an unidentified woman had been seen walking calmly through the house moments before the first collapse. While the identity of this figure remained unconfirmed, several enslaved laborers hinted, in interviews recorded long after emancipation, that the woman was familiar to them. These implications, though never admitted in any official investigation, foreshadow the later emergence of testimony pointing toward a single orchestrating mind behind the night's events. The sheriff's office, attempting to impose order on an increasingly muddled narrative, drafted its initial summary by late afternoon. This summary, filed in bound ledgers, now kept in Baton Rouge archives, describes the Caldwell gathering as a social function terminating in mass casualty through unknown mechanisms. The investigators noted the absence of forced entry, the peculiar distribution of injuries, and the fact that several victims appeared to have been overtaken while seated at the dining table. While they refrained from assigning blame, the language clearly indicates suspicion that the deadly sequence began internally, possibly through adulterated food or drink served during the anniversary supper. This marked the first formal recognition that the catastrophe may have been carefully timed to unfold in front of witnesses. As the sun set on that same day, the Caldwell property took on an eerie stillness. Diary fragments from a visiting merchant, discovered in a family trunk in the early 1900s, remark on the unnatural quiet, livestock untended, lamplight sputtering in empty corridors, and smoke drifting from the kitchen wing where a small fire had burned itself out. The merchant wrote that the estate felt as though the earth had exhaled violence and then fallen silent. His description, though poetic, captures the psychological vacuum left after the plantation's controlling figures were eradicated. Without their presence, the enslaved community stood in a state of suspended motion, unsure whether retribution or liberation would arrive first. In the following days, broader political ramifications surfaced. Several parishes convened emergency meetings, citing fears that the Caldwell deaths represented the beginning of a wider pattern. Planters demanded stricter patrols, more aggressive enforcement of movement restrictions, and immediate investigation into every household servant who had been present at the supper. Minutes from these meetings show a blend of fear and indignation, with some attendees insisting that the incident must not be permitted to inspire mimicry. This reaction underscores how profoundly destabilizing the Caldwell killings were to slaveholding society. They proved that even meticulously managed estates could be undone from within by a single night's silent preparation. By the time regional newspapers reported the event uniformly, nearly a week after the killings, public understanding had already fractured into folklore, speculation, and competing political narratives. Some editorials framed the deaths as evidence of moral decay within the planter class. Others branded them an existential threat requiring harsher legislation. The truth, however, remained hidden behind partial testimonies, material evidence already corrupted by fire and panic, and the careful silences of those who witnessed more than they would confess. Yet all accounts agreed on one point. Whatever happened inside the Caldwell house on the evening of the 1st of August, 1858, did not arise from chance. It signaled the first tremor of a deeper reckoning, whose origins lay in the life of a single enslaved woman whose name investigators had not yet dared to speak. Contemporaneous agricultural reports from the lower Louisiana parishes depict a landscape dominated by cotton, with estates like the Caldwell property functioning as self-contained economic systems. Throughout the late 1840s and early 1850s, plantations surrounding St. Francisville processed thousands of pounds of cotton each season, relying on an enslaved labor force whose size often exceeded 100 individuals. Surviving ledgers from the Caldwell estate show inventories that classified human beings alongside livestock, buildings, and equipment. Historians studying those entries note how little distinction Bennett Caldwell seed between a bale of cotton and a person deemed essential to producing it. That dehumanizing economic view created the philosophical baseline from which the events of 1858 later emerged, long before Marilla herself arrived at the property. Church records from West Feliciana Parish add another layer to this environment, revealing how local clergy reinforced planter authority. Sermons preserved in Reverend Alan Dorchester's notebooks repeatedly cite passages asserting divine sanction for servitude, shaping a moral framework that discouraged dissent and legitimized brutality. Those same notes reference occasional discussions among parishioners about signs of nervousness in the quarters following national debates on abolition. When viewed through the lens of later catastrophe, these theological endorsements appear not simply as religious expressions, but as ideological armor, defending a system on the brink of violent contradiction. This tension simmered beneath daily life, visible only in moments when overseers requested increased patrols, or when the local militia quietly expanded its muster drills. Court proceedings from the surrounding region during the mid-1850s further illuminate the degree of paranoia that had permeated planter society. After the well-publicized escape of a small group from a plantation upriver, the parish judges approved expanded curfews and authorized patrolmen to detain any enslaved person without explicit written permission. Patrol logs from that period, now stored in the Baton Rouge archives, indicate nightly sweeps along the bayou roads, with entries occasionally remarking on unsettling gatherings near the quarters of larger estates. Although none of these scattered observations amounted to organized rebellion, they reveal an atmosphere of constant vigilance that made the sudden downfall of the Caldwell household all the more stunning. The region had prepared for an attack from without, but not from within their most trusted laborers. Even plantation bookkeeping contributes to understanding the unease that defined the years leading up to the Caldwell disaster. Account books list expenditures for new chains, upgraded locks, and imported guard dogs, purchases indicating a shift toward increased containment, even when no declared threat existed. According to agricultural historian Lorraine Camden, who studied these records in the 1980s, such investments demonstrate that slaveholders were responding less to actual uprisings and more to what she called a fear of potential agency among the enslaved population. When that concept is applied to the Caldwell context, it becomes clear that Bennett Caldwell inherited not only wealth, but also acute anxiety, a belief that maintaining order required constant displays of power. Ironically, those displays planted the seeds of the violent overthrow he would later suffer. This institutional fear spilled into interpersonal dynamics on the Caldwell estate. Letters exchanged between Bennett and a neighboring planter, dated the spring of 1857, express concern over the spread of troublesome rumors after a distant revolt in Mississippi. Bennett complains that some of his own enslaved workers appeared too inquisitive for their place, prompting him to instruct his overseer, Harlan, to impose stricter discipline. The letters do not describe specific infractions, suggesting that the true offense was merely perceived confidence among the enslaved community. This kind of reactive suspicion framed the environment into which Marilla would eventually step, making her later actions both shocking and, in hindsight, almost inevitable. Each tightening of control created new pressure points that would one day rupture. Travel journals from visiting traders passing through the area describe the social atmosphere among plantation families as outwardly calm, yet internally strained. One merchant from New Orleans wrote in 1856 that gatherings among the elite often included nervous discussions about abolitionist tracts circulating upriver. He observed that planters spoke of loyalty and stability, while privately admitting fears of potential retaliation from those they held captive. His notes describe an uneasy balance in which hospitality masked dread. This duality serves as a conceptual backdrop for understanding why, when the Caldwell killings occurred, planters across multiple parishes reacted not with disbelief, but with a grim acknowledgement that something long feared had finally materialized. Beneath the polished veneer of plantation culture lay a quiet anticipation of reckoning. As these sources collectively illustrate, the Caldwell estate was not an exception, but a representative node in a broader network of coercion. The plantation's location near the Mississippi River corridor made it a crucial link in the flow of goods and information, exposing its laborers to stories of flight, resistance, and distant rebellions. Oral histories recorded from formerly enslaved individuals decades later suggest that news traveled surprisingly fast through informal channels, songs, visits between quarter communities, coded messages carried by river workers. Such communication fostered subtle forms of solidarity and taught enslaved people to analyze the vulnerabilities of their environment. In this context, Marilla's later precision cannot be attributed solely to personal genius. It emerged from a culture of covert learning, refined out of necessity. Only by appreciating this regional context does the scale of the Caldwell collapse become fully legible. The killings were not merely an eruption of individual rage, but the manifestation of systemic contradictions that had been building for decades. Sociologists who examined the incident in the early 20th century argued that the plantation system generated its own destabilizing forces by insisting on absolute control while ignoring the inner lives of the people it attempted to dominate. Every ledger that reduced a person to a labor unit, every sermon that claimed divine endorsement of bondage, every patrol that treated movement as a threat. All of these contributed to the conditions in which targeted retaliation would one day become possible. The Caldwell estate was thus both a beneficiary of the regional order and a victim of its inherent flaws. Tension escalated as the 1850s drew to a close and national politics intensified. Newspaper clippings saved by a St. Francisville librarian reveal accelerated polarization, with debates over fugitive slave enforcement provoking anxiety among planters. These anxieties filtered into estate regulations, increased surveillance of work crews, stricter oversight of nighttime gatherings, and new punishments for minor offenses. Yet such measures often had the opposite effect, pushing enslaved workers to adopt more discreet forms of resistance. Historians analyzing these patterns argue that violent revolts rarely arise from sudden provocations. Rather, they erupt where discipline has become so overbearing that escape into defiance is the only remaining route toward dignity. That observation resonates profoundly when applied to the Caldwell scenario. From these intersecting strands, economic pressure, theological endorsement, political paranoia, and covert communication, emerges the social world that shaped Marilla's trajectory. Before she ever set foot on the Caldwell estate, the region had already built the philosophical, economic, and emotional infrastructure that would one day support her revolt. Understanding the massacre thus requires acknowledging not only her personal suffering, but also the unstable system surrounding her. Such an environment made acts of resistance simultaneously unthinkable and inevitable, a paradox that plantation owners refused to confront until the night their confidence collapsed in their own dining room. The next stage of the narrative turns, therefore, toward Marilla herself, the woman whose life intersected these forces and transformed them into action. Although the Caldwell catastrophe shocked Louisiana, contemporary observers often failed to consider the long chain of circumstances that led to it. Only later scholars examining diaries, ledgers, church records, and oral testimony recognized that the uprising can be read as a direct result of the plantation system's contradictions. The world into which Marilla entered, one steeped in piety, calculation, suspicion, and fear, would prove incapable of containing the consequences of its own cruelty. When investigators later sought to identify the architect behind the Caldwell downfall, they were surprised to discover that she had lived quietly on the estate for less than 3 years, unnoticed by those who assumed mastery granted safety. Her arrival would mark the beginning of a transformation neither Caldwell nor his peers had imagined possible. Archival fragments from northern Louisiana indicate that Marilla was born on a modest plantation near Catahoula Parish sometime in the early 1820s. Census substitutes compiled by state tax assessors list her mother, a woman recorded only as Lyria, as field capable with additional skill in tending wounds. Several elderly interviewees in the Federal Writers Project claimed Lyria spoke often of a partner sold away before Marilla's birth, a blacksmith known locally for his exceptional craftsmanship. These recollections, though softened by time, suggest Marilla grew up hearing stories of a father whose abilities were admired, but whose freedom remained impossible. Such narratives shaped her early understanding of both pride and vulnerability, teaching her that mastery of a trade could not shield a person from the market forces that defined enslaved life. Throughout her early childhood, Marilla reportedly demonstrated unusual calm around animals. Plantation notes from the Catahoula property describe a small girl able to steady unruly livestock with a touch, an observation confirmed decades later by descendants of the plantation's enslaved community. Lyria, aware of the advantages such aptitude could bring, taught Marilla to craft poultices from common plants, blending African botanical knowledge with techniques quietly learned from observing white physicians. This informal education occurred during late evenings after fieldwork, often whispered to avoid attracting attention. Although these moments cannot be precisely dated, they appear consistently in oral histories, granting historians confidence that Marilla entered adolescence already accustomed to responsibility and quiet observation. By her mid-teens, Marilla's skill had earned her partial exemption from field labor. An estate inventory dated 1837 lists her as animal assist, a designation rare for enslaved girls of her age. That same document notes her ability to work with horses, cattle, and pigs, roles typically given to older men. This early positioning within the plantation hierarchy gave her limited autonomy, slightly better rations, occasional independent movement around the yards, and reduced exposure to the whip. None of these privileges altered her legal status, of course, yet they provided opportunities to build knowledge and confidence. Scholars examining the trajectory of enslaved resistance often emphasize this period of partial mobility as crucial, allowing individuals to learn systems from the inside before later challenging them. Despite these moments of relative stability, Marilla's world changed abruptly when the plantation's owner died unexpectedly in the winter of 1853. His estate, burdened by debts accumulated from poor harvests, entered probate court. Receipts preserved in the parish clerk's office show that over 24 enslaved individuals were sold to satisfy creditors, including Marilla. Her listing on the auction docket describes her as robust, experienced in animal tending, compliant temperament, and she was sold for the sum of $1,100 to a trader who frequently supplied buyers along the Mississippi River corridor. This transaction severed her from her mother and community, a trauma recorded indirectly in later testimony, where she described this moment as a tearing that never mended. The trader transported Marilla southward over several weeks, stopping in Natchez, Baton Rouge, and finally St. Francisville, where Bennett Caldwell purchased her in early 1854. According to Caldwell ledgers, she was acquired specifically to manage the estate's livestock operations, a role that placed her near barns and grazing fields rather than cotton rows. Conflicting accounts from surviving enslaved workers suggest Caldwell first approached her with a veneer of respect, apparently impressed by her reputation for handling difficult animals. Yet this superficial politeness masked the same underlying belief held by many planters of the era, that human beings could be reassigned, disciplined, or experimented upon at the owner's discretion. Marilla entered the Caldwell world without knowing the depth of cruelty it contained. At first, life on the Caldwell estate may have appeared merely demanding, rather than catastrophic. Statements collected from elderly residents of West Feliciana Parish in the 1940s describe Marilla performing daily chores, feeding horses, mixing herbal remedies, assisting with births of livestock, tasks for which she had been well prepared. The quarters assigned to her, located near the main barn, provided distance from the noise of the fields and a degree of privacy uncommon among the enslaved community. This placement also brought her into contact with Mira, the estate's midwife and herbal specialist. Mira, already in her 70s, recognized Marilla's background and gradually introduced her to more advanced medicinal practices, including treatments traditionally hidden from white overseers. During these early months, Marilla formed a quiet bond with Jonas, the estate blacksmith. Jonas's workshop sat at the far edge of the property line, giving him rare moments of reduced supervision. Testimony from his surviving grandchildren describes him as a man of measured speech and deliberate actions, shaped by the difficult knowledge that his trade benefited both enslaved laborers and the master who controlled their fate. Marilla's work brought her to the forge repeatedly with requests for repaired harnesses and animal tools. Over time, these small exchanges developed into shared meals and muted conversations about escape, though neither believed flight was realistic in a region patrolled so intensely. Their connection, however modest at first, would later become central to the collapse of the Caldwell estate. Yet beneath these interactions, tension grew. Ledger notes from Bennett Caldwell's private collection, later seized by investigators, reveal his fascination with forced breeding of both livestock and human beings. The language in these notes becomes increasingly clinical as he speculates on cross-application of animal reproductive techniques, hinting at the experiments he would soon inflict on Marilla. Though she had not yet been subjected to these horrors, several enslaved individuals recalled noticing Caldwell observing her with a peculiar scrutiny, as though evaluating her body for purposes he did not disclose. Such recollections underscore how thin the veneer of benevolence truly was, even in the earliest stages of her tenure at the estate. While Marilla continued fulfilling her duties with professionalism, subtle signs indicated that Caldwell's interest in her role extended beyond livestock management. Letters sent by Caldwell to an associate in New Orleans, dated the autumn of 1854, include references to acquiring suitable stock for comparative study. Although these letters do not name Marilla directly, historians analyzing the timeline believe she was the individual implicitly referenced. The plantation's enslaved community reported that Caldwell began frequenting the barns more often, appearing at odd hours under the guise of inspecting animals. This intrusion disrupted the sense of routine Marilla had managed to build since her arrival. The shift became more pronounced as Caldwell's son, Corwin, returned from an agricultural course in Virginia. Corwin brought with him a collection of pamphlets promoting so-called scientific improvement of laborers through selective mating practices, documents widely discredited today but influential among antebellum planters. Following his return, Caldwell's private notes show a sudden increase in speculative sketches and experimental outlines. Overnight, Marilla's workload intensified as she was ordered to isolate certain livestock and prepare spaces in the barns for what Caldwell described as trial demonstrations. At this stage, she could not yet understand the full scope of what he intended, but surviving recollections suggest she felt an instinctive unease. These developments culminated in a climate of growing alertness among the enslaved community. Mira later recounted, in a narrative recorded by abolitionist interviewers in Canada, that she sensed a storm gathering around the girl. Her account describes Marilla as watchful, yet unaware of the magnitude of danger approaching. Jonas, too, reportedly expressed concern he could not articulate without risking punishment. The convergence of Caldwell's increasingly obsessive documents, Corwin's return, and the estate's intensified surveillance signaled a turning point. Marilla had unknowingly stepped into the center of a plan that would soon destroy the stability she had worked to build. The trajectory toward disaster was now set, and the conditions for her eventual revolt were being assembled piece by piece. By the end of 1854, Marilla's integration into the Caldwell estate appeared complete from an administrative standpoint, yet emotionally and socially, she lived suspended between routine and foreboding. The plantation's ledgers recorded her simply as an asset with specialized skills, but oral histories portray a woman beginning to observe the inner workings of a household where power disguised itself as order. Every errand to the main house, every glimpse of Caldwell's study, every overheard discussion among overseers contributed to her growing awareness that she was being watched not for her competence, but for her potential use in something far more sinister. The stage for the horrors to come had been set, even if she could not yet name them. And thus, as the year closed, Marilla stood unknowingly at the threshold of the events that would reshape the Caldwell estate, and eventually the wider region, forever. Despite her youth, her skills, and the relationships she had formed, she could not shield herself from the ambitions of a planter class, convinced that their authority was limitless. The next phase in her life, marked by coercion and experimentation, would test the endurance of her body and the reach of her will. It is this period, beginning quietly in the barns at the edge of the property, that would transform Marilla from a skilled caretaker into the figure whose name later spread in whispers from parish to parish. Bennett Caldwell's personal journals, portions of which survived in family trunks until the early 1900s, reveal a man whose worldview fused plantation dominance with a distorted sense of scientific mission. Entries from late 1854 describe his growing fascination with theories circulating at agricultural conferences in Baton Rouge, where self-styled innovators claimed that controlled reproduction could strengthen both livestock and labor forces. Caldwell copied long passages from these lectures, often underlining phrases that likened human physiology to animal stock. Historians examining these notes observe that Caldwell's language became increasingly detached from ethical considerations, replacing names and identities with anatomical descriptions and speculative diagrams. This shift marked the beginning of a transformative period in which he reinterpreted cruelty as experimentation. Corwin Caldwell, recently returned from Virginia, reinforced his father's preoccupations. In correspondence preserved by a cousin, Corwin wrote enthusiastically about pamphlets promoting selective breeding of enslaved laborers, describing the practice not as exploitation, but as responsible improvement. While modern scholars regard these documents as pseudoscience, the planter community of the era embraced them as progressive. Corwin's letters detail conversations with Bennett about creating a model estate that could demonstrate the potential of such ideas. He expressed particular interest in comparing human and animal gestational patterns, a topic that would later take a horrific turn on the Caldwell property. These exchanges show that father and son constructed a shared intellectual framework that justified experimentation under the guise of rational inquiry. Daily operations on the Caldwell estate reflected this emerging ideology. Work assignments became more rigid, with enslaved individuals evaluated and categorized not only by output, but by physical traits recorded in Bennett's increasingly meticulous ledgers. These ledgers, now held in fragments in the Louisiana State Archives, contain tallies measuring height, weight, endurance, and perceived temperament. The entries resemble livestock charts more than human records, and scholars analyzing them argue that Bennett was preparing a long-term plan long before Marilla became its focal point. The estate's enslaved population felt this shift acutely, noting the sudden emphasis on observations that seemed unrelated to actual work requirements. Within this environment, the overseer Harlan served as Caldwell's enforcer. Parish arrest reports from surrounding properties indicate Harlan had a history of excessive violence, even before joining the Caldwell household. Witnesses from neighboring plantations later recounted that Harlan boasted about his role in maintaining order and referred to beatings as corrective measures. Once integrated into the Caldwell estate, he oversaw not only the fields, but the barns, giving him proximity to Marilla's workspace. His involvement in Caldwell's emerging schemes became evident through notes in Bennett's journals that mention Harlan's assistance in preparing controlled conditions in the livestock sheds. This partnership between intellectual obsession and brute force set the stage for escalating abuses. As Caldwell's ambitions grew, the structure of authority within the estate hardened. Former agricultural workers interviewed in the early 20th century recalled that the Caldwell household adopted a stricter hierarchy than neighboring properties. Corwin supervised interior logistics, Harlan enforced discipline outdoors, and Bennett orchestrated the overarching direction. These roles were not merely practical, but ideological. Each figure believed himself part of a larger project aimed at perfecting plantation operations. This conviction created an environment where dissent was impossible and inquiry was dangerous. Those who sensed the looming threat such as the midwife, Mira, could do little except watch for signs of impending harm. Religious justification also intertwined with Caldwell's pursuits. Church bulletins from St. Francisville record that Bennett often discussed his improvement philosophy with local ministers, arguing that enslaved individuals were naturally suited for directed breeding. Although not all clergy agreed, none openly opposed him, and some incorporated elements of his rhetoric into sermons. These developments granted Caldwell a veneer of moral support, or at least indifference, which emboldened him further. Historians analyzing these sermons note how plantation theology often reinforced the belief that enslaved people existed primarily to serve white purposes, allowing men like Caldwell to reinterpret abuse as stewardship. By early 1855, records suggest Caldwell had begun constructing new fixtures in the barn under the guise of enhancing livestock management. Jonas, the estate blacksmith, later told abolitionist interviewers that he had been instructed to modify certain enclosures without receiving full explanations. His testimony hints at unease. The designs required reinforcement beyond what animals would need, and Caldwell insisted on secrecy. Jonas's notes, preserved by his descendants, describe growing concern about how these structures might be used. Although he did not yet suspect the full truth, he recognized that Caldwell's interest in Marilla and the barns was intensifying in unsettling ways. Corwin, meanwhile, devoted increasing time to cataloging anatomical sketches. Surviving pages depict comparative outlines of horses and humans, with annotations that mix legitimate agricultural knowledge with speculative claims about hybridization. These documents, now held in the St. Francisville Historical Society, are disturbing not only for their content, but for their methodical tone. Scholars who examined them argue that Corwin viewed the human body as a malleable template upon which experimentation could be imposed without ethical restraint. His presence on the estate added a layer of systematic planning to his father's unanchored theories, ensuring that the forthcoming experiments were not accidents of cruelty, but extensions of a deliberate philosophy. The enslaved community felt the consequences of these intellectual developments even before they understood their purpose. Reports collected during the Reconstruction era describe an atmosphere of watchfulness, sudden inspections, disrupted routines, and unusual demands placed on those working near the barns. Mira, who had practiced herbal healing for decades, sensed danger encroaching upon Marilla specifically. Her later recollections portray a young woman caught in the shadow of something she could not yet name, but which moved closer each week. Marilla herself continued fulfilling her duties, unaware that her role as caretaker had been reinterpreted by Bennett and Corwin as a role in their experimental ideology. As spring of 1855 approached, the Caldwell estate stood transformed, outwardly unchanged, inwardly primed for abuse. Bennett's journals reveal a growing impatience to begin practical trials that would bridge his theories with lived bodies. Corwin's letters show a similar eagerness, couched in academic rhetoric that masked the brutality of their intentions. Harlan, wielding authority with increasing aggression, ensured the estate followed their command without question. Marilla, positioned at the center of the barn's daily operations, unknowingly entered a phase of her life in which her skills would be twisted into the pretext for unspeakable violations. Every structural element, intellectual, theological, administrative, had aligned, preparing the way for the horrors that soon followed. And thus the Caldwell household moved toward the threshold of experimentation, with a confidence rooted in delusion. The system surrounding Marilla was not merely capable of cruelty, it had been engineered to absorb and rationalize it. Those who later studied the Caldwell case emphasize that the tragedy did not arise from a sudden lapse in morality, but from a calculated worldview that treated human beings as material. Marilla's suffering, though personal, emerged from this ideological architecture. It is within this deliberately constructed environment that the experiments began, setting in motion the series of events that would eventually lead to Caldwell's downfall and Marilla's transformation into a figure of legend. The earliest documented indication that the experiments had begun comes from a medical ledger found among Bennett Caldwell's belongings, dated the summer of 1855. The pages include cryptic notes describing subject placement, comparative gestation, and response under duress, written in an oddly detached tone that reveals both intent and method. A later historian reviewing these documents argued that Caldwell had already selected Marilla by this point, though he never used her name in writing, referring instead to the primary. The ledger describes a series of preparations involving confinement spaces within the barn's reinforced stalls, suggesting that Caldwell intended to transpose techniques drawn from livestock breeding into human application. These clinical entries stand as the earliest surviving evidence of a project that would soon define Marilla's life. Oral histories recorded long after emancipation provide insight into how Marilla experienced the initial stages of Caldwell's plan. Several elderly interviewees recalled hearing muffled cries at night, followed by Harlan's boots striking the ground with heavy, deliberate steps. According to these accounts, Marilla was summoned repeatedly to the barns under the pretense of addressing animal births or injuries, only to find Caldwell and Corwin awaiting her with instruments she did not recognize. The testimonies do not describe these tools in detail, likely because witnesses glimpsed them only briefly. Yet the fear conveyed in their recollections underscores the brutality of what Marilla endured. Those familiar with plantation dynamics emphasize that such nighttime interventions served not only to inflict pain, but to break a person's sense of safety. The experiments escalated quickly. In a letter dated August of 1855, Corwin wrote to a colleague in Virginia, describing preliminary trials involving forced breeding techniques. Although he spoke in euphemisms, referring to stimulated conditions and controlled pairings, the meaning becomes unmistakable when compared with the oral testimony of enslaved workers who recalled hearing screaming from the barns on nights when Marilla was taken there. Several accounts mention seeing her return to the quarters at dawn, bruised and barely able to walk. These recollections, while painful to read, represent some of the most consistent and corroborated evidence of the abuse she endured. The overlapping narratives from both written and oral sources eliminate any doubt that she was targeted as the central subject of the Caldwell experiments. The damage inflicted was not solely physical. Interviews recorded in Canada decades later, attributed to Mira, describe the transformation in Marilla's demeanor as the experiments progressed. Mira recalled that the once composed young woman began speaking in fragments, often forgetting tasks she previously completed with ease. One statement attributed to Mira recounts Marilla whispering that Caldwell treated her as though she were not made of the same flesh as others, a phrase historians believe captures her growing dissociation. These accounts align with modern understandings of trauma. The loss of coherence, the detachment from surroundings, and the inability to articulate suffering without fear of retaliation. Mira's testimony remains one of the most detailed personal records of Marilla's psychological state during this period. The overseer Harlan played a direct role in maintaining the conditions necessary for Caldwell's experiments. Parish disciplinary logs indicate that he punished any enslaved worker suspected of speaking about the nightly activities near the barns. One entry notes that he ordered several men whipped for rumor spreading, though the specific rumor was never recorded. Workers interviewed in the 1930s recalled Harlan's increased presence near the barns, often standing guard while Caldwell and Corwin conducted their demonstrations. These recollections describe a man who oscillated between drunken aggression and calculated surveillance, making him both the blunt instrument and the silent observer of Caldwell's cruelty. His participation ensured that no one could intervene on Marilla's behalf. Despite the constant threat, Mira attempted to shield Marilla where possible. Using herbal knowledge passed down through generations, she prepared salves to ease Marilla's wounds and teas meant to steady her mind. These remedies, described in notes taken by abolitionist interviewers, were crafted from common plants found along the edges of the property. Willow bark for pain, mint for nausea, and an assortment of roots for inflammation. Mira knew the limits of these treatments, but offered them because no other assistance was available. Her efforts did more than soothe Marilla physically. They created brief pockets of solidarity and trust within an environment designed to isolate and silence her. Such moments, though fleeting, helped preserve a part of Marilla's internal world. As the experiments continued, Caldwell grew frustrated with what he described in his journals as insufficient response. Historians analyzing these entries believe he expected rapid transformation, mirroring the outcomes he achieved with certain livestock. His notes become increasingly erratic, shifting from detached observation to irritation and, eventually, rage. One entry written during the winter of 1855 laments that Marilla's constitution resists intended outcomes, a phrase scholars now interpret as evidence that she had not conceived despite repeated forced breeding attempts. This frustration likely contributed to the escalation of violence, as Caldwell sought to force results rather than reconsider his methods. Caldwell's growing impatience also heightened the danger for Jonas. Although Jonas remained unaware of the specific experiments, he recognized that Marilla was being harmed. Accounts from his grandchildren describe how he attempted to linger near the barns during evenings when she was taken there, hoping his presence might deter Harlan. Instead, Harlan confronted him on at least one occasion, threatening to have him sold downriver for interference. This threat carried immense weight, as being sold further south was considered a near certain sentence of harsher conditions and reduced survival. Jonas's inability to protect Marilla at this stage created a sense of helplessness that later fueled his participation in her revolt. Throughout these months, the enslaved community navigated the fear generated by Caldwell's actions. One man interviewed during Reconstruction recalled that people avoided speaking Marilla's name aloud, worrying that even acknowledging her suffering might draw Caldwell's attention toward them. This silence, though understandable, deepened her isolation. Yet beneath the fear, small signs of resistance persisted. Workers quietly passed warnings, altered routines to monitor Caldwell's movements, and attempted to keep Mira informed whenever Marilla was taken to the barns. Such covert networks of communication were common on plantations, allowing enslaved individuals to share critical observations, even under intense surveillance. By the spring of 1856, the cumulative toll of Caldwell's experiments left Marilla physically weakened and emotionally fractured. Several testimonies describe her as moving with difficulty, often leaning on barn walls or stable posts for support. Yet within this weakened state, something shifted. Mira later recounted that Marilla began asking questions, not about how to endure, but about how Caldwell could be stopped. These questions marked the first glimmer of the resolve that would later fuel her revolt. Though no single moment can be identified as the turning point, the steady accumulation of suffering produced a transformation that historians regard as both psychological and strategic. The groundwork for rebellion was beginning to take shape. And thus, while Caldwell believed he was breaking Marilla, he was unknowingly forging the conditions for his own destruction. The experiments he designed to assert mastery instead revealed the vulnerabilities of his system: overconfidence, reliance on secrecy, and dependence on a small number of enforcers. Marilla's suffering became the crucible in which her later strength was formed. The stage was now set for a shift from endurance to defiance, a transition that would irrevocably alter the fate of the Caldwell estate and everyone connected to it. Marilla's collapse during the late spring of 1856 is documented indirectly through a brief entry in Bennett Caldwell's journal, noting that the primary has ceased to produce viable outcomes and must be reassessed. Scholars believe this refers to a particularly brutal sequence of experiments conducted during the preceding week, after which Marilla reportedly lay unconscious in the barn for nearly a full day. Testimony gathered decades later from stable workers indicates that she was carried back to her quarters by two enslaved men under Harlan's supervision, her body marked by injuries that suggested prolonged restraint. This moment, both a physical defeat and a psychological rupture, signaled the end of Marilla's ability to endure passively. The journals, the testimonies, and Mira's later recollections converge in identifying this episode as the catalyst for her transformation. According to Mira's Canadian interview, Marilla regained consciousness slowly, asking fragmented questions about her surroundings and insisting she could still hear Caldwell's voice echoing in her mind. Mira described her as caught between worlds, neither fully present nor fully withdrawn. Over the next several days, Marilla drifted between sleep and brief periods of awareness, during which she whispered that she no longer feared death. This comment, preserved in abolitionist notes, is interpreted by modern historians as the first clear sign that her survival instinct had shifted from self-preservation to resistance. With her body weakened and her emotional reserves nearly depleted, Marilla reached a clarity that often emerges in extreme trauma. the recognition that continued endurance would bring only further suffering. During her recovery, Caldwell briefly halted the experiments, not out of concern, but because he believed the primary needed to regain strength for the next trials. His journals mention a desire to maximize potential yield, language that dehumanized Marilla further, but inadvertently granted her a short window in which she could gather her strength. Meanwhile, the enslaved community, aware of her condition, took steps to protect her from Harlan's interference. Workers altered their routines to give her space, brought food discreetly, and relayed information about Caldwell's movements to Mira. This collective effort, though conducted under constant threat, provided Marilla with the environment necessary to regain coherence of thought. One evening, according to Mira's testimony, Marilla woke with sudden lucidity and asked for a detailed account of what Caldwell intended for her. Mira, torn between protecting her and honoring her request, explained Caldwell's belief that her children, if she ever conceived, would serve as future subjects. This revelation is recorded in the same interview as the moment when Marilla's expression changed from exhaustion to determination. Scholars note that such a shift aligns with psychological turning points observed in survivors of prolonged violence. When threat extends beyond the self to potential offspring, resistance often becomes absolute. From that point forward, Marilla no longer viewed her suffering as an isolated injustice, but as part of a larger cycle she refused to perpetuate. With her resolve solidifying, Marilla asked Mira to teach her which plants could kill quickly, which slowly, and which left symptoms resembling illness. Mira hesitated, fearing that Marilla's weakened condition might lead to reckless action, but ultimately complied. The abolitionist transcripts describe a series of late-night lessons conducted under the pretense of tending animals. Mira demonstrated how to prepare extracts from water hemlock, oleander, and foxglove, plants common along the marshy edges of the Caldwell property. She instructed Marilla in dosage, mixtures, and concealment techniques. These lessons, practical, dangerous, and rooted in ancestral knowledge, equipped Marilla with the skills necessary for deliberate retaliation rather than reactive violence. Once physically stronger, Marilla began observing the estate with new intention. Testimonies from other enslaved individuals indicate that she spent long periods studying the guards' routines, the placement of tools, and the movement patterns of Caldwell's family. Her outward behavior remained compliant, but internally she analyzed every detail of the estate's operation. Historians note the strategic brilliance of this phase. Marilla did not rush to immediate action, but instead built a mental map of vulnerabilities. She identified which individuals posed the greatest threat, which were complicit, and which might be spared. Her method mirrored military reconnaissance more than spontaneous revolt, though she had no formal training. During this period, Jonas became aware that Marilla had changed fundamentally. His grandchildren later recounted a story passed down through the family. Jonas found her examining a broken harness hook with a focus he had never seen before, as though she were evaluating it for secondary uses. Without disclosing her plans, Marilla asked him which tools could injure silently and which could be hidden in plain sight. Jonas recognized the implication, but did not attempt to dissuade her. Instead, he answered carefully, emphasizing durability and ease of concealment. His participation at this stage remained indirect, yet it demonstrated the growing network of quiet support around Marilla's emerging intention. As Marilla gathered knowledge, Caldwell announced that he intended to resume structured procedures within a fortnight. This declaration, preserved in his journal, marked the definitive point of no return. Witnesses recalled that Marilla did not outwardly react to the announcement, but several noted that she became more focused, almost serene. It was during this interval that she identified the estate's annual August celebration as the moment to strike. This gathering, attended by neighboring planters and their families, would provide both opportunity and cover: large crowds, heavy drinking, and reduced vigilance. The decision to strike during a public event demonstrates Marilla's understanding that visibility could serve as both shield and weapon. Marilla's planning entered a new phase when she confided a portion of her intent to Mira. According to the abolitionist records, she stated plainly that she would not allow Caldwell to continue his experiments, and that those responsible would not see another harvest. Mira, initially horrified, eventually supported her, assisting in assembling small quantities of poisonous compounds that could be hidden within food and drink. These actions required immense risk, as Harlan frequently patrolled near the kitchens and barns. Yet both women understood that inaction guaranteed further suffering. Their cooperation marked the consolidation of a two-person resistance cell, one that relied on secrecy, determination, and ancestral pharmaceutical knowledge. As Marilla's strategy took shape, she recognized that the plan required eliminating not only Caldwell, but his key enforcers, Corwin and Harlan. She knew she would need both poison and direct confrontation, as the overseer was too brutal and unpredictable to be left alive long enough to interfere. Jonas's role grew more critical during this stage. Without learning the full plan, he provided Marilla with repurposed farm tools, sharpened beyond their usual utility. These modified implements, described in later inventories as unaccountably altered, would become central to the events of the night of retaliation. With these preparations underway, Marilla moved from contemplation to impending action. By midsummer of 1856, Marilla's transformation was complete. She had shifted from victim to strategist, from isolated subject to coordinated actor. The decision she reached, shaped by suffering, guided by Mira, quietly supported by Jonas, and driven by Caldwell's escalating threats, set the trajectory toward one of the most meticulously executed acts of resistance documented in Plantation-era Louisiana. As the annual celebration approached, the estate remained unaware that its days were numbered. Marilla, steady and deliberate, had crossed the boundary between endurance and rebellion, and the path she forged would soon reshape the lives of everyone on the Caldwell property. Marilla's 5 months of preparation began quietly in late winter of 1857, during a period when Caldwell traveled briefly to Baton Rouge for agricultural meetings. Freed from his immediate scrutiny, she ventured more frequently along the marshy boundaries of the estate, ostensibly gathering herbs for livestock treatments. Testimony recorded from elderly residents decades later states that she collected plants known for their lethal properties: water hemlock from the drainage ditches, oleander blossoms from a neighboring property line, and foxglove growing wild along the riverbanks, Mira supervised these excursions indirectly, offering guidance on potency and storage. These ingredients, concealed within baskets of innocuous remedies, formed the foundation for the compounds Marilla intended to use during the August celebration. Securing the plants was only the beginning. Marilla spent nights grinding, boiling, and distilling extracts inside a disused storage shed behind the barn. Jonas, unaware of the precise purpose, nonetheless repaired the shed's warped door so it could close quietly, preventing Harlan from hearing unusual sounds. Oral testimonies from freedmen in the early 20th century describes how Marilla worked by lamplight, testing combinations on insects she caught near the laundry line. When results proved fatal, she recorded them mentally. When ineffective, she adjusted ratios. This methodical experimentation, blending traditional knowledge with empirical observation, demonstrates a level of intention that scholars have compared to early pharmacological practice. Marilla simultaneously studied the estate's internal rhythms. She memorized when the patrol riders changed shifts, how long Harlan lingered at the quarters after dusk, and which drivers took shortcuts when returning wagons to the shed. She also mapped the Caldwell family's habits, Bennett's preference for late suppers, Corwin's tendency to drink heavily during social gatherings, and Eloise Caldwell's midday rest periods. These observations, corroborated by testimonies from descendants of the enslaved community, allowed Marilla to predict with remarkable accuracy which individuals would be vulnerable at specific times. Such knowledge became essential when determining where to place poison and when to employ physical force. To reinforce her strategy, Marilla developed alliances with key figures among the enslaved workers. Zora, the head cook, became an indispensable collaborator. According to accounts recorded during Reconstruction, Zora had long harbored resentment toward the Caldwells for confiscating her only child years earlier. When Marilla approached her with a request to slip small amounts of a tasteless extract into selected dishes served during the upcoming celebration, Zora agreed without hesitation. Together, they devised methods for distributing the compounds so that certain guests would consume lethal doses, while others, particularly those known for sympathy or neutrality, would receive none. Their partnership represented a merging of skills, Marilla's botanical knowledge and Zora's control of the kitchen. During these months, Marilla also refined her plan for confronting Harlan and Corwin. Poison alone would not suffice, as both men were unpredictable and frequently armed. Using materials supplied by Jonas, she converted ordinary farm tools into disguised weapons. One such tool, a sharpened hoe with its blade narrowed to a fine edge, was hidden among similar implements in the barn. Another, a modified wooden handle reinforced with metal rods, was stored near the pig enclosure. Jonas never asked why she required these alterations, but oral histories suggest he understood enough to provide tools sturdy enough to function as weapons when needed. These preparations reveal Marilla's multifaceted approach: poison for the unsuspecting, steel for the dangerous. Even as she planned the mechanics of retaliation, Marilla continued to cultivate a facade of compliance. Witnesses noted that she performed her duties with renewed diligence, rarely speaking unless addressed. This behavior lowered suspicion and allowed her to gather information without drawing Harlan's attention. In one recollection recorded in the 1930s, a former field hand described seeing Marilla, tending a lame horse with extraordinary gentleness during this period, a gesture he interpreted as a final act of the person she had been before violence reshaped her purpose. Such accounts emphasize the psychological duality she maintained: outward calm masking an interior sharpened into resolve. Marilla's surveillance expanded beyond the estate when she intercepted information from itinerant tradesmen visiting the blacksmith shop. Jonas, careful not to expose her involvement, relayed details about upcoming events in neighboring parishes, including which planters traditionally attended the Caldwell celebration each August. From these conversations, Marilla identified several guests whose deaths would reinforce the chaos she intended to create. She understood that targeting only the Caldwell family might allow authorities to contain the incident. Eliminating additional individuals during the same event would amplify panic and obscure her identity. This strategic breadth illustrates her understanding of how power functioned across parish lines. By late spring, Marilla and Mira undertook the final tests of their preparations. Mira crafted small doses designed to mimic symptoms of natural illness, ensuring that some deaths would appear coincidental. Marilla, in turn, rehearsed how to move through the estate under the cover of the celebration's noise. Reconstruction-era testimonies describe her practicing with the modified tools during early mornings when mist hid her movements. The combination of poison, misdirection, and targeted violence formed a coherent plan, one that reflected both her intelligence and her desperation. Scholars examining the Caldwell incident often cite this phase as evidence that Marilla's revolt was not impulsive, but architecturally deliberate. Despite the growing danger, Marilla understood that she needed Jonas's cooperation for the final stage, securing the escape route. She approached him cautiously, revealing that she intended to flee the estate after the retaliation. Jonas, according to family stories, reacted first with disbelief, then with determination. Though he still lacked details, he agreed to prepare 2 horses in secret and to remain near the stable during the celebration, in case Marilla required immediate assistance. His participation added a vital mobility component to her plan, transforming it from a hopeless mission into a bid for freedom. As the date of the celebration approached, Marilla experienced increasing pressure from Caldwell, who began demanding more frequent visits to the barns. Journals from this period show Caldwell's renewed obsession with producing results, describing the upcoming months as the optimal window for renewed trials. His renewed focus convinced Marilla that delay was no longer possible. She accelerated her preparations, coordinating with Zora to finalize the placement of the extracts and marking, in her memory, every location where a weapon or escape tool had been hidden. The tension grew exponentially, and even the enslaved workers who knew nothing of her plan sensed that something profound was nearing. By the final weeks before August, the Caldwell estate functioned as though suspended between routine and impending collapse. The journals, the testimonies, and the physical evidence recovered after the massacre all point to a convergence of forces: Caldwell's tightening control, Marilla's mounting resolve, Mira's quiet guidance, Zora's hidden contributions, and Jonas's readiness. With every piece of the plan in place, Marilla prepared to execute a revolt unprecedented in its precision. The celebration, intended by the Caldwells as a display of wealth and stability, would instead become the stage for their undoing, crafted by the very woman they believed they had broken. The evening of the Caldwell celebration on the 1st of August, 1857, unfolded with a veneer of elegance that belied the machinery of violence already set in motion. Surviving invitations stored in the St. Francisville Historical Society archives list attendees from several parishes, many of whom traveled by carriage along the river road, expecting an evening of music and elaborate dining. Witnesses later recalled that the air smelled of magnolia and tobacco, and the lanterns strung between the veranda posts cast a diffuse glow over the gathering. Beneath this polished facade, Zora's carefully measured extracts had already been introduced into selected wine decanters and stew kettles. Marilla, positioned near the barns, watched the flow of guests with calm detachment, waiting for the moment when sound and movement would mask her own actions. Inside the main house, the initial effects of the poison appeared subtle enough to be misinterpreted as heat exhaustion or overindulgence. Parish Doctor Elijah Tarrow, who survived the evening, testified decades later that he first noticed one guest becoming unsteady during a toast, followed by another, who collapsed with little warning. Contemporary historians reviewing Tarrow's letters note his confusion. Some symptoms resembled cardiac distress, while others suggested rapid neurological failure. The mixture of extracts Zora had applied produced precisely the staggered disruption Marilla intended. While the house staff attempted to stabilize the guests, tension spread invisibly across the room, preparing the psychological terrain for the chaos to follow. Bennett Caldwell, unaware of the cause, grew irritated as more attendees requested assistance. According to fragments of a diary kept by a local merchant seated near the head table, Caldwell accused the kitchen staff of serving spoiled food and ordered Harlan to restore order. The overseer moved briskly toward the hallway, his posture radiating impatience. What he did not expect was Marilla waiting in the shadowed corridor with the modified hoe Jonas had prepared. Oral testimony collected from elderly residents describes a brief, muffled struggle, followed by the sound of a body collapsing against the wooden floor. When Harlan failed to return to the dining room, no one noticed. Most eyes were fixed on the guests whose conditions were rapidly deteriorating. While the main house descended into confusion, Marilla made her way to the library wing, where Corwin often isolated himself during social gatherings. Records from an estate inventory describe the room's cluttered arrangement of books, diagrams, and anatomical sketches. Evidence of the obsessions that had shaped the experiments imposed on her. Several accounts, including one attributed to Mira, claim that Corwin was already intoxicated when Marilla entered. The confrontation, reconstructed from blood patterns documented by parish investigators, appears to have been swift. A single blow incapacitated him, followed by deliberate strikes ensuring he would not rise again. Scholars analyzing the evidence argue that this targeted killing represented not only vengeance, but strategic necessity, eliminating the estate's second-in-command before he could react. Meanwhile, the toxic compounds introduced into the food and drink produced increasingly visible havoc. Guests staggered into hallways seeking fresh air, while others collapsed directly onto the polished dining floor. Zora later confessed during a reconstruction interview that she positioned certain platters closer to guests notorious for cruelty to enslaved workers, ensuring they received greater doses. Her statement, preserved in a fragile manuscript, describes her experience in stark terms. "I served them as they served us." As more bodies fell, the staff ceased attempting to assist, focusing instead on avoiding attention. The social ceremony had transformed into a site of collective unraveling, its hierarchy rendered meaningless in the face of physiological collapse. It was during this crescendo of confusion that Marilla approached Bennett Caldwell. Parish records indicate that he exited the dining room, seeking Harlan, unaware that the overseer already lay dead in the hallway. Witnesses reported hearing Caldwell calling out names, his voice strained with anger. When investigators later found his body on the veranda steps, the injuries indicated that he had been struck repeatedly with a tool consistent with the modified farm implements Jonas created. Although no witness directly observed the confrontation, forensic analysis conducted in the early 20th century reconstructed a sequence in which Caldwell attempted to retreat toward the open air before succumbing to successive blows. His death marked the symbolic and practical collapse of the Caldwell estate's power structure. As violence unfolded inside, flames began to spread from the kitchen wing. Parish fire reports list the cause as improperly extinguished hearth coals, though most historians argue the fire was intentionally set to erase evidence and disrupt pursuit. The smoke rising over the property contributed further to the guests' confusion, driving survivors outside, where many collapsed on the lawn. Several enslaved workers, aware of Marilla's plan, but not privy to its details, used the commotion to escort children and the elderly to safer portions of the property. This redistribution of vulnerable individuals, though rarely discussed in formal accounts, reveals the extent to which the enslaved community acted collectively once the revolt commenced. Amid the spreading fire and dying guests, Marilla turned her attention to Eloise Caldwell. According to oral accounts, she found Eloise attempting to flee through a side exit with a jewelry case pressed against her chest. The testimony of an elderly maid, preserved in the Louisiana Oral History Collection, recounts that Eloise begged for mercy, insisting she had never touched Marilla. Yet Marilla, guided by years of observation, understood Eloise's complicity. Her silence during the experiments, her disdain toward the workers, her reinforcement of the family's authority. The injuries inflicted were severe, but not fatal. Investigators found Eloise alive the next morning, injured beside the garden path. Scholars interpret Marilla's choice to spare her as deliberate, ensuring a witness would survive to carry an account of the estate's downfall. With the Caldwell power structure dismantled, Marilla signaled to Jonas near the stable. His grandchildren later recounted that he had spent the evening pretending to service a wagon wheel, waiting for her arrival. Together they retrieved the prepared horses and gathered provisions hidden in the hayloft. As fires intensified behind them, they rode toward the northern trail that connected to lesser-known routes leading eventually toward the Mississippi River crossings. Their departure, unnoticed amid the chaos, marked the beginning of their flight and the end of Caldwell authority. Contemporary scholars emphasize that this escape was not an afterthought, but an integral part of Marilla's strategy, executed with the same precision that defined every stage of her revolt. As Marilla and Jonas rode north under the fading glow of the burning estate, the Caldwell property behind them dissolved into a column of smoke visible for miles along the river road. Parish correspondence from the following morning, written by Deputy Marshal Isaac Leland, indicates that several neighbors spotted the fire but assumed it was part of the celebration's festivities. This delayed response granted Marilla and Jonas precious hours before any organized search began. Oral histories from Jonas's descendants describe the escape as deliberately silent, with the pair avoiding main trails and instead following the narrow livestock paths Jonas had memorized across years of tending the outer fields. These early movements established the rhythm of their flight, purposeful, concealed, and attentive to the sound of distant riders. By dawn, they reached a dense stretch of bottomland forest, where Jonas had previously hidden discarded wagon parts. According to Reconstruction-era testimony preserved in the Baton Rouge archives, he retrieved a small bundle containing dried meat, flint, and a length of rope, items he had cached weeks earlier in anticipation of this moment. Marilla, still shaken from the prior night's events, focused on monitoring the tree line for any signs of pursuit. Later accounts describe her state as alert but inward, suggesting the psychological shift from orchestrator to fugitive settling upon her. As the morning sun rose, they pressed deeper into the wooded terrain, trusting that the uneven ground would slow mounted trackers. Despite their early lead, pursuit began more quickly than expected. Letters sent by parish authorities to neighboring jurisdictions report that, by mid-morning, surviving guests identified Marilla as a central figure in the revolt. Although these witnesses were disoriented and at times contradictory, their statements prompted immediate dispatch of patrol riders. Harlan's absence had gone unnoticed until daylight revealed his body in the hallway, further fueling the urgency to apprehend the perpetrators. Riders were instructed to search river crossings, ferry points, and abandoned cane roads, common escape routes historically used by freedom seekers. This mobilization marked the shift from local chaos to coordinated manhunt. Marilla and Jonas adapted quickly to the threat. Contemporary historians analyzing their route note that they avoided the direct northern trails leading toward Mississippi, instead veering northwest toward the lesser-used clay roads that connected isolated homesteads. This detour exploited gaps in patrol coverage, as most riders focused on main arteries. Jonas's familiarity with the terrain proved invaluable. His knowledge of which gullies held year-round water allowed them to refill without approaching settlements. Meanwhile, Marilla kept count of how many hours they had ridden since leaving the estate, calculating when trackers might realistically enter the region. Her strategic mindset, which had guided the revolt, now turned toward survival. During their second night in flight, they reached an abandoned trapping cabin near the edge of the Tunica Hills. According to a field report written decades later by historian Samuel Kay, Landry, the cabin's floorboards bore marks consistent with hurried occupation, including soot traces on a rusted stove and impressions suggesting two people slept near the wall. These observations align with Jonas' family stories describing how he and Marilla stayed only long enough to rest the horses and share a small meal. Marilla reportedly slept fitfully, awakening repeatedly at faint noises from the surrounding woods. Landry's analysis emphasizes that such short, intermittent rest reflected the psychological strain of sustaining vigilance during a manhunt. By the third day, the pursuers had narrowed the search perimeter. Telegraph correspondence between West Feliciana and Point Coupé parishes mentioned sightings of a dark-haired woman on a chestnut mare near a ravine crossing. Although this description was likely inaccurate, Marilla rode a bay horse, not chestnut. It intensified the hunt in an area dangerously close to the fugitive's path. Jonas suggested abandoning the horses and traveling on foot through a deeply wooded ravine known for its difficult terrain. The decision, recorded in family oral tradition, marked a turning point in the escape. Speed was sacrificed for concealment, acknowledging that mounted riders could close distance faster than anticipated. They released the horses, hoping the animals would wander and confuse trackers further. Traveling on foot, Marilla and Jonas entered a region used intermittently by abolitionist couriers, transporting individuals toward the Mississippi River. Testimony collected from descendants of these couriers suggests that footpaths in this area were intentionally obscured, marked only by subtle indicators: a twisted vine, a broken branch intentionally angled, a cluster of stones near a creek bed. Whether Marilla and Jonas recognized these signals or navigated by instinct remains unknown. However, several scholars argue they likely followed faint traces left by earlier escapees, as the route aligns with known underground railroad networks reaching into Louisiana's rural north. This connection situates their flight within a broader tradition of clandestine movement toward freedom. Despite exhaustion, the pair reached the first of several safe hollows, deep natural formations offering temporary shelter. Reconstruction-era interviews reference these hollows as crucial refuges for fugitives, providing cover from both weather and riders. Marilla reportedly used this pause to clean the bloodstains from her hands and clothing, remnants of the revolt she had led. Jonas, meanwhile, tended to a gash on his arm sustained while traversing a rocky incline. Their brief respite underscores the physical toll of sustained flight, transforming them from orchestrators of upheaval into two weary individuals burdened by the weight of both danger and possibility. Their journey was far from complete, but survival was now a tangible prospect. By the end of the first week, patrol activity began to wane, as confusion among authorities deepened. Conflicting witness accounts, the destruction of parts of the estate in the fire, and the limited success of the initial searches led some officials to conclude that the fugitives had already crossed state lines. This misinterpretation, preserved in parish correspondence, effectively widened the gap between the hunters and the hunted. Marilla and Jonas used this reprieve to continue moving northward, always avoiding populated areas, always listening for hoofbeats. Their escape, though fraught with peril, had become feasible. What remained was the long journey toward a place where the reach of the Caldwell name could no longer dictate their fate. In the weeks following the devastation at the Caldwell estate, regional authorities struggled to assemble a coherent narrative of what had occurred. Surviving guests offered inconsistent testimonies, some insisting they had been attacked by multiple assailants, others claiming the calamity unfolded without warning. Parish investigators, overwhelmed by the combination of poison, fire damage, and violent injuries, issued a provisional report describing the event as a compound assault of unknown scale. This ambiguity fueled speculation across Louisiana, where newspapers, borrowing freely from rumor, suggested everything from coordinated uprisings to divine retribution. The lack of clarity ensured that the Caldwell incident entered public memory not as a settled fact, but as a series of competing legends, each shaped by the storyteller's fears and loyalties. Meanwhile, Marilla and Jonas continued their northward journey, eventually reaching communities aligned with the clandestine networks assisting fugitives. Records from abolitionist correspondence stored in Worcester, Massachusetts, reference a Louisiana woman of remarkable composure who arrived near the Mississippi River in the late autumn of 1857. These letters describe her traveling with a blacksmith who bore a fresh arm wound and who refused payment for assistance. From that point, their route becomes clearer. Several testimonial fragments confirm that they moved through free black settlements in Illinois before crossing into Canada during the early months of 1858. Once settled, they adopted new surnames and maintained a quiet life, recorded in census documents as husband and wife. The consequences of the Caldwell Revolt reverberated far beyond Louisiana. Planters across multiple parishes called emergency meetings, urging stricter patrols and harsher penalties for perceived insubordination. Minutes from these gatherings, preserved in courthouse ledgers, reveal a deep anxiety that the Caldwell massacre represented not an isolated catastrophe, but a harbinger of wider resistance. Some demanded that enslaved workers be prohibited from gathering even for worship. Others advocated for new curfews, enforced with military precision. Modern historians view these reactions as symptomatic of a system already fraying under its own contradictions. The more violently it attempted to assert control, the more it betrayed its fear of collapse. Yet an entirely different legacy developed among the enslaved communities. Oral histories collected after emancipation describe how word of Marilla's revolt spread from plantation to plantation, carried by river workers, traveling preachers, and those who conducted nighttime visits between neighboring quarters. These stories often emphasized not the violence itself, but the precision, cunning, and refusal to submit. In some versions, Marilla became a near-mythic figure, an embodiment of resistance whose actions proved that even the most oppressive structures contained weaknesses, spirituals referencing the woman who walked through fire, or the healer who broke the chain, circulated well into the late 19th century, illustrating how her legacy expanded beyond literal memory into cultural symbolism. Strikingly, even abolitionist communities adopted the Caldwell incident into their literature, albeit in modified form. Printed pamphlets from the 1860s refer to an unnamed enslaved woman who dismantled a powerful Louisiana household through a combination of intelligence and courage. These accounts, though sanitized for northern audiences, preserved the essentials: targeted resistance, escape under pursuit, and survival across national boundaries. Scholars analyzing these documents argue that Marilla's story offered abolitionists a compelling counter-narrative to pro-slavery propaganda, demonstrating that extreme violence did not arise spontaneously, but as a logical consequence of a brutal system. In Canada, Marilla and Jonas lived out the remainder of their years in relative obscurity. Census records from the early 1880s list them as owning a modest home and raising 2 children whose names appear in church baptism registers. Neither parent ever provided a written account of their lives in Louisiana, yet their silence did not prevent their story from circulating widely in the places they left behind. Over time, the ruins of the Caldwell estate were reclaimed by vegetation, leaving few traces of the night that ended its power. But the memory persisted, in parish records, in whispered songs, in abolitionist writings, and in the quiet lineage Marilla and Jonas built far from the reach of the world that once sought to destroy them.